Some people have asked me how I got whole body osteoarthritis, which is an extremely rare and unlikely condition. And I've always been transparent that it resulted from my own actions. 18 years ago, when I was 23 years old, I made a series of mistakes that caused permanent joint damage all throughout my body. But I've always been vague about exactly what happened. I always call it classified information. But today in this video, for the first time, I'm going to tell the story of how my zeal for running, my overconfidence in my own judgment when it came to injury management, and the advice of a quack podiatrist all combined forces to cause permanent disability. This is a cautionary tale on several fronts, but probably more than any other about the danger of self-directing your own medical intervention. And I also use my experience to demonstrate a plausible mechanism for how osteoarthritis develops. The story starts with my background in track and field. I ran track seriously in high school and also as a serious competitive amateur for about 5 years after graduating, and my life used to revolve around that. I was a pretty good runner, but not good enough to go pro. Still, all throughout my early 20s, I continued organizing my life around running, even though I really should have been letting go of it at that point. Part of that was my attachment to the sport of track and field and running, but another part of it was bad exercise philosophy. I used to believe that running is good for health and physical fitness. I no longer believe that. As of 2006, when this all happened, I was starting to understand that running is not a valid form of exercise, but I hadn't fully accepted that premise yet. So whether for exercise or recreation, I still wanted to run. And when I couldn't run because of injury, I became very agitated and restless because it felt like I was losing precious time to pursue my main purpose in life. Unfortunately for me, I was very ignorant about injury management. As of 2006, I had mostly lost confidence in the medical community when it came to treating running injuries. In all my years as an athlete, I had never gotten any help from a doctor or physical therapist. And as a result of those experiences, I was starting to become very self-driven in my medical and injury management decisions. I wasn't asking doctors for their opinion, rather I was telling them what I wanted to do. And the problem was I didn't know anything either, and I didn't know what I didn't know. I was always way too aggressive. I was much too apt to always rush into the most aggressive form of intervention. And by age 22, I had already had 3 arthroscopic surgeries, which I now know were all unnecessary. Part of that was bad doctors, which were just everywhere in that time and place. But another part of it was me and the fact that I was driven to try to treat every little physical problem aggressively in the false belief that medicine could fix things. In late 2005, I was hit with an old nemesis injury of mine, medial shin splints. This injury had derailed my running career when I was 19 years old and made me miss a whole track season. And then late in 2005, when I was 22, I got caught in another injury loop with medial shin splints. And when that happened, I was ready to go all out to resolve it as quickly as possible and avoid a repeat of what happened before. The first thing I did was seek out the services of a podiatrist to get orthotics, which are something that I normally don't believe in. I'll talk more about that later. Orthotics are not necessarily something that's normally considered aggressive, but the ones I received and the way that I ended up using them certainly was. The podiatrist I got mixed up with was an absolute kook. This guy diagnosed tibialis posterior tendonitis, which is a bizarre misdiagnosis given that that anatomy doesn't even correspond to the part of my shin that hurt. And he prescribed the most ridiculous set of orthotics I had ever seen. These things were completely rigid and they were so built up, they practically locked my feet in place. And he instructed me to wear these things in conjunction with the Brooks Beast, which is the bulkiest, clunkiest motion control running shoe on the market. And this combination of footwear was like having my feet encased in concrete. It was ridiculous. Nobody needs that much support. And if you do, you certainly have no business running. Now, this recommendation of his disgusted me because I'm philosophically a minimalist, and I was back then as well. That means I believe you should run as closely to barefoot as possible. I don't believe in any kind of supportive footwear in the long term. My idea was just to use orthotics temporarily in the short term to try to relieve some of the strain on my shins while walking in the hope that that would allow them to heal faster. But once the injury was resolved, I was going to discard the orthotics and transition to minimalism. The fact that he thought people should just walk around like this all the time was truly disturbing, and I should have run for the hills the moment I saw that in him. But even though I disagreed with the orthotics, I had the belief that I needed some kind of external support for my feet in the short term, and he certainly was a willing resource for that. The day he gave me the orthotics, he also offered immobilization in casts as an option. Now, this situation was the perfect storm for a disaster to happen. Here I was, this zealous runner, and I was self directing my own medical treatment, and I knew nothing, but I was willing to go to extremes. And I was linked up with this kook podiatrist who had misdiagnosed my shin pain, and he was happy to provide me with these very aggressive tools, which in the wrong hands are tools of orthopedic destruction. Still, I was the one directing everything. I was just using him to get what I thought I needed. At the end of the day, I was making all the decisions and I was in the driver's seat. In my ignorance, I used a palpation test to assess my own injury. And that involved just pressing on the inside of my shin to see if it hurt. And if it did, I thought that meant I had an injury that was not healed yet. I don't remember whether I got that idea from the podiatrist or not, but that turns out to be a false premise. It normally hurts to press on that area. It's just a naturally sensitive area. And so that palpation test produced a false positive that led me to believe my injury was much worse than it really was. I believed wrongfully that it was unsafe to progress back to running until it no longer hurt to press on my shin. So I went over a month without running and the palpatory pain persisted, again because it's normal. In my frustration, I decided to escalate to more drastic measures, and I attempted absolute rest to heal the injury. Not only did I stop running, I stopped even walking around normally. And so I circled back around to the podiatrist and requested that he immobilize my legs in casts like he had previously mentioned. I was supposed to wear the casts for 3 weeks, but I couldn't keep them on because they were too problematic. And this led to a cycle where I would wear the cast for a few days or maybe a week, and then I would cut the casts off and I would be outside of them for a few days or a few weeks. Then I would go back to the podiatrist wanting to start over, and he would happily oblige and put new casts on me. And I was in and out of casts for several months. When the cast came off, there was visible atrophy, and this made me lose confidence in my ability to use my legs without aggravating the injury that I wrongfully believed I had. And I blamed the podiatrist for that. I was very angry at him because his ideas had just made me weaker. But I kept pressing on the inside of my shin and it still hurt. And that made me believe, again wrongfully, that it wasn't even safe for me to progress back to normal walking. When the casts were off, I continued to rely on other means of avoiding putting stress on my feet. For every step I took, I relied on the aggressive bracing of the orthotics, and I allowed them to bear the weight of my body instead of my own muscles and joints. I also experimented with other forms of unloading, like taping my arches and occasionally wearing removable walking boots. And these things perpetuated the unloading and disuse even beyond the casts. I used these measures for months, but none of them resolved the palpatory pain. It just persisted. But rather than reevaluate what I was doing and change course, I doubled down on it in the belief that even more careful rest was required to heal the injury. And I even exaggerated my symptoms to justify it. I think I acted like it hurt even just to walk, when in fact I could walk just fine and it only hurt just to press on my shin. Now, the kook podiatrist had given me some of the wrong ideas that were in my head, and he certainly gave me the means to act on them. But ultimately, my actions were self-driven, and I took things further than he recommended. He didn't tell me that I was to be completely immobile until it no longer hurt to press on my shin. That was my own escalation. He also asked me to go to physical therapy, and I didn't do it. I also talked to several other doctors during this time period, and none of them endorsed what I was doing, yet I continued doing it anyway because I thought that I knew best. Now, the whole time, all this inactivity was miserable for me, and I was desperate to get back to running as soon as possible. That's why I was doing it in the first place. But all this disuse was causing serious atrophy and deconditioning, and I knew I was going to require months of rehab before it would be safe for me to run again. But I had no idea how much I was playing with fire. I did not understand the abject danger of prolonged disuse because I didn't understand the significance of articular cartilage. Cartilage is the critical tissue that lines the surfaces of the bones that come together to form a joint. And its function is to provide a low friction bearing surface so that the bones can easily glide against each other during movement. It's the tissue that allows movement, and it's an amazing tissue. Normal, healthy cartilage is extremely resilient, and if you treat it right, it'll last a lifetime. But if you don't, the consequences are severe and permanent. Cartilage requires normal movement and mechanical loading to maintain its homeostasis and its tensile strength. It doesn't have a blood supply, and so it relies on movement to exchange joint fluid, and that's how it breathes. Now, if you deprive it of that movement and that loading by means of disuse, it atrophies or becomes weaker. And in that weakened state, it's vulnerable to damage from stresses that would normally be tolerable. If you were to reintroduce activity gradually, it would strengthen up again. But if you interrupt that period of disuse by suddenly imposing high forces on the joint, you can cause permanent joint damage. Why permanent? Because unlike other tissues like bone, tendon, muscle, cartilage does not have an intrinsic healing mechanism, so any damage is permanent. So after 5 months of self-imposed disuse, one day I just couldn't take it anymore, and I threw off all the bullshit supports and orthotics and started walking around normally again. And it felt beautiful. That's what I should have done all along. Now, I knew I was nowhere near ready to run again yet. I had Disuse Syndrome, and I knew that if I ran at this point, I would risk severe injury. Again, I didn't recognize the nature of the injury I would be risking. And I was dying to run again. That tension was building. After just a few days of normal walking, I went to the Prefontaine Classic in Eugene, Oregon, which is a big world-class track meet. And I'm pretty sure that made me want to run even more. And while I was at that track meet, I tried just trotting a few steps. Not running, but just lifting my feet gently and kind of just bouncing along just for a few steps. And as I was doing that, I thought to myself, oh my God, I'm actually running again. And it was surreal because I hadn't even walked normally in 5 months, but it didn't seem to hurt me. I had a bone scan scheduled for a few days later, and I got the idea to try to intentionally aggravate whatever was wrong with my shins in the hope that that would amplify the evidence of the injury on the study. So the next day, I went down to my old high school track and I ran in my bare feet. And from the very first step, I had sharp pain, not in my shins, but in my feet. And I tried to push through it at first, but I could only make it about 3 to 5 minutes before I had to stop because the pain became too severe. The next day when I woke up, my feet and ankles were severely swollen and it hurt even just to bear weight. And it was clear that I had caused a new injury. When the bone scan results came back a few days later, they showed intense abnormal metabolic activity at the joint level all throughout my feet and ankles and also in my knees. And what's interesting is that those abnormal findings were much worse on my right side than on my left side. All throughout this episode, I had babied my right leg much more because that leg is much more naturally mobile. That premature running after prolonged disuse had caused multiple tissue injuries throughout my feet. It caused multiple bone stress reactions and muscle and tendon strains. Those issues resolved quickly, but as they did, a new symptom emerged coming from my joints, and it was crepitus, which is a creaking or grinding sensation with joint movement. Recall the one tissue that never heals when it's injured. Within a few months, I realized that I had sustained permanent joint damage to all the joints of my lower extremities, not just my feet and ankles, but also my knees and hips. 5 months of self-imposed disuse had caused serious cartilage atrophy in all the joints of my lower extremities, and 3 to 5 minutes of running in that state was all that it took to cause permanent joint damage and the onset of osteoarthritis in those joints. Now you might ask, how did orthotics cause this cartilage weakening in all the joints of my lower extremity? Well, they were very aggressive orthotics, and they not only directly unloaded the joints of my feet, but they also changed the biomechanics of my entire lower extremities, such that it changed how the load was distributed across the joint surfaces. And then when I suddenly threw off the orthotics and tried to run again, it exposed those joints to movements and forces that they hadn't encountered in months. And that was enough to cause permanent cartilage damage and the onset of osteoarthritis. So that particular sequence of events culminating in that sudden disuse-overuse mechanism perfectly explains the joint damage in the joints of my lower extremity. But what about the joints of my upper body? How did anything related to orthotics and running cause the joint damage in the distal interphalangeal joints of my fingers, for example? Well, the connection there is less clear, but I think I have a pretty good theory. When I realized what I had done to the joints of my lower body and the fact that I would never be able to run again, I had a total emotional and psychological collapse, and I became bedridden. For about 6 months, I just lay in bed constantly, probably 23 hours a day or more. And that bed rest caused a second wave of disuse that affected the joints of my upper body and my spine. Now, I can't pinpoint the exact moments of joint overuse that led to the joint damage in my upper body, but sporadically I would get out of bed and do mildly physically strenuous things like yard work or other just short bursts of activity that I would do on a whim. And it was those moments that probably caused the damage to the weakened cartilage of my upper body joints. And so ultimately, my own stupidity led to my joint destruction. I've long since forgiven myself for it. It doesn't matter anymore. What matters now is just making the most of what I have left. Experience is the best teacher, and that experience did allow me to learn a lot, not only about the concrete mistakes that led to the joint damage, but also about the greater life philosophical mistakes that set up that whole situation to happen. And for 18 years since then, I've been able to live a much better life, even despite my condition, because I have much greater clarity now. And if I could go back and trade the lessons I learned from that for the ability to run again, I wouldn't. I'll never run again, but at least I won't die a complete fucking idiot now. A word about the podiatrist. I have not forgiven him. He was the doctor. He should have known better. For him to prescribe those ridiculous orthotics, and especially the casts, was abject malpractice. I never sued him because, as responsible as he was, my own actions were probably even more responsible, and therefore my own actions obfuscated the connection between his negligence and the outcome, and I never could have proven the damages. Still, he has a terrible reputation in the community, and that does somewhat avenge me. I strongly believe that the disuse-overuse mechanism that caused my osteoarthritis is a major cause of osteoarthritis in the general population. Activity is not dangerous, but erratic patterns of it are. Many people are basically sedentary their entire adult lives, but invariably they're exposed to occasional high-force actions, and those moments in their lives can cause permanent damage to their weakened cartilage. This is not part of standard medical knowledge. Most doctors believe that osteoarthritis is simply caused by wear and tear, but you can find obscure references to this disuse mechanism of osteoarthritis in the medical literature, and so it is known that disuse is implicated in the etiology of osteoarthritis, and I found this out the hard way. So the upshot is, move your damn joints, because your ability to remain pain-free and able-bodied throughout your life depends on it. I believe all able-bodied adults should walk at least 2 miles a day, but I don't support things like running and CrossFit because those are repetitive high-force activities that can damage cartilage, especially if your cartilage is weak. What I support instead is low-force, high-intensity strength training. That's the ideal form of exercise. That's how you strengthen your muscles while you protect your cartilage. I'm going to put a link to my favorite resource for proper exercise in the description. So now you know how my own stupidity caused my whole body osteoarthritis. And not that you would have anyway, but now hopefully you won't be as inclined to repeat my mistakes.